Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Spiritual Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of the title that I will not say on YouTube because I might get into trouble. But I will say this, if you take simple gematria, which is numerology, where A equals 1 and B equals 2, C equals 3, D equals 4, and so on and so forth until all the way to Z or Z, which is 26. The title of this book corresponds to the 17th letter of that alphabet. So you guys can figure it out because I know you guys are very smart. This particular book was inspired by the universe, actually, and I won't get into the story here. There's a little backstory about that. I kind of went into it in my introduction video, which I will leave a link in the description box below for you guys to check it out if you guys are interested in the little story. But you know, the subtitle of this particular book is called The Earliest Gospel. An Introduction to the Original Stories and Sayings of Jesus. John S. Kloppenborg is the author. Before we begin, if you like what we do here, please do consider checking out our other book clubs. We have our health book clubs on Wednesdays and then financial book clubs on Thursdays. And we put all the books that we've read, the past books as well as present books on YouTube. And we have it on a playlist, so you guys can just download it. And for those who are auditory, who likes to just listen as an audiobook, you guys can listen to it while you're stuck in traffic or doing household chores or walking your dog or whatever. So you guys can do that. And we have other contents on there as well, not just book clubs. So please do check it out, like and subscribe and comment and all that good stuff. If you have a book or books, plural, that you like to recommend for us to read, I'll leave a link in the description box below on there as well, so you guys can recommend it. We love to hear from you. We love to see what's in your library. And I think, reading, in my opinion, is a lost art. And so thank you for being here. Kudos for you for being on this journey. And then if you feel so inclined, please do sign up for our free monthly newsletter. And if you want to support us further, you can buy me a coffee, leave a donation. Check out our merch. We have many different merch for your fur babies, little doggies and kitties, as well as humans. And we are periodically updating our designs as well as coming up with new designs every month. So come back often, check it out, support us that way. And if you are in the Los Angeles area or visiting LA, please do consider coming and visiting us in person. We have a healing center that we use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for both domestic cats and dogs and people, humans. So you could read all about that on our website as well as our other services as well. So whatever way, shape, or form that you guys support us, we want to thank you very, very much. Most importantly, thank you for being here. Thank you for your presence and thank you for reading. Like I said, I think it's a lost art, and because it reading has a different frequency, a different vibration. It's a slower vibration than talking, for example, or videos, right? Or movies. It takes more energy because you got to absorb it, you got to slow down, you got to digest it. So it's a very different type of activity. And I want to thank you for being here and for being on this journey with us. So, okay, so we will be reading this. There are some endnotes in this book. I will not go through that. If you have a book, you can go ahead and check it out at the back of the book if you guys want to do a deeper dive into it. I do want to say this before we start. Um, in my opinion, uh, God is meant to be experienced. It is meant to be transformative. Um, it's not meant to be categorized, theologized, philosophized, etc., etc. Um, so keep that in mind as we read through this particular book. Okay, so let us begin. This is chapter 1, and this will be part 3. Now, this book has charts and graphs and stuff, and I'm not sure if I'm going to go through describing those graphs because it's a little hard for me to do that. But if you have a book, you can, follow it there and decipher it yourself. I'm not really a charts person, really. But anyways, we'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll go by, we'll play it by ear, see what happens, see how I feel, see what Spirit says. Okay. All right. So here we go. From medial Mark to prior Mark, several kinds of consideration suggest that Mark is the earliest of the three synoptics. One reason for considering Mark as prior to Matthew and Luke rather than dependent on one or both of these Gospels has to do with assessing Mark's omissions. If Mark knew and used Matthew either A or D in Figure 1, okay, let's review Figure 1 a little bit here. So Figure 1 are these little bubbles. Uh, And I'll just stop there, pause there for a couple seconds for you guys to kind of check it out and review. So you got the simple line, the straight line, uh, the simple branch and conflation. All right, I won't go over that because we went over it already. But you guys get the idea. Okay. He must also have omitted a number of Matthean pericope, including the account of Jesus' birth, the Sermon on the Mount, many parables, and especially the account of Jesus' appearance to his disciples after his death. The latter omission would be particularly awkward to explain, since Mark repetitively has Jesus predict his resurrection. Mark 8:31, 9:9, all of chapter 31, and then 10:32 to 34, and even has him declare that he will meet his disciples in the Galilee, 14:27, which is precisely where Matthew's Jesus appears. Matthew 28:16 to 20. Mark, however, famously ends his gospel with the woman at the tomb, quote, not telling anyone anything for they were afraid, end quote. That's 16:8. An ending that reverses Matthew's conclusion, where Jesus commands the women to tell his brothers that they will see him in the Galilee, which the reader must assume happens since the disciples see Jesus on the mountain in the Galilee, 28:16 to 20. Likewise, if Mark knew Luke either B or D in Figure 1, he must also have omitted Luke's infancy stories. The Sermon at Nazareth, Luke 4:16 to 30, the Sermon on the Plain, many of Luke's parables and sayings found in Luke 9:51 to 18:15, and the resurrection appearances. It is perhaps imaginable that Mark might have omitted Luke's appearance stories since they are all centered on Jerusalem, not the Galilee. But why omit the account of Jesus' birth and childhood? Johann Jakob Griesbach, who thought that Mark used and condensed both Matthew and Luke, suggested that Mark was silent about the infancy of Jesus because he wished to concentrate on Jesus as a teacher. And there's an endnote about that if you guys want to do a deeper dive to it. But this explanation will hardly do since Luke's repeated motif of the young Jesus growing in wisdom, 240, chapter 240, chapter 2, verse 40, and chapter 52. And his story of Jesus debating with the scribes at the age of 12, 241 to 52, functioned precisely to demonstrate that Jesus' teaching abilities were manifest from a very young age. That is, Luke's infancy story serves to underscore a major Markan theme, and hence it is difficult to conclude that Mark would have omitted it if he knew Luke's account. Second, to see Mark as later than Matthew and Luke raises some grave difficulties regarding the depiction of Jesus' family. As is well known, Matthew makes clear that Joseph was told about the identity of Jesus by an angel, Matthew 1:20-21. And Luke describes Mary as understanding the wondrous events surrounding Jesus' birth and childhood, Luke 2:19 and 51. Note again that while both Matthew and Luke treat Jesus' family as positively disposed to him, they do so differently, another sign of the independence of Matthew and Luke. Yet, Mark treats Jesus' family as opposed to him and as unknowing. They attempt to seize him on the belief that he is insane. Mark 3:20-21, an episode which both Matthew and Luke omit. Mark also relates a story of Jesus' family wanting to speak with him and Jesus' response. He points to the crowd of disciples with the words, quote, "See, my mother and my brothers, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Mark 3:34-35. Given Mark's context, this can only function as a rejection of Jesus' birth family. Mark's treatment of Jesus' family is negative, whether or not he had Matthew or Luke in front of him. But if Mark used either Matthew or Luke or both as sources, his inversion of their positive representations of Jesus' kin is remarkable and does not correspond to any other known representation of Jesus' family in the early church, which, as time went on, viewed Jesus' kin more and more positively. The likeliest scenario is that rather than Mark inverting a positive depiction of Jesus' family in his source or sources, Matthew and Luke are undoing Mark's critical perspective of Jesus' family. Finally, when we compare Mark with Matthew and Mark with Luke, it is clear that in general, Matthew's and Luke's version of Mark's stories are improved, both grammatically and in terms of their content. Throughout, where Mark displays the excessive use of and to join clauses, Matthew uses an array of subordinating conjunctions, participial, sorry, butchered that word, participial phrases, and other devices to arrive at a better flowing style. Matthew also eliminates certain problematic expressions in Mark. For example, at Matthew 13:58, he has, quote, "And Jesus did not perform any mighty deeds there because of their unbelief," end quote. Where Mark 6:5-6 has, quote, "And Jesus could not perform any mighty deeds there except that he laid his hands on a few sick persons and healed them, and he marveled at their unbelief," end quote. Matthew's version avoids the inference that Jesus, a powerful wonder worker, was somehow unable to perform miracles. On the contrary, it was the lack of faith that Jesus encountered in his hometown, which inclined Jesus not to perform many wonders. Similar observations can be made regarding Luke and Mark. Luke's Greek is better than Mark's, with greater use of subordinating conjunctions and better connectives. Luke also emphasizes Jesus' piety, 4:16, and prayerfulness to the extent that each key event of Jesus' career, his baptism, the choosing of his disciples, Peter's confession, the transfiguration, Jesus' teaching on prayer, and the visit to Gethsemane is accompanied by prayer. And in contrast to Mark, the Lucan Jesus dies not with a cry of abandonment, but with a prayer. Quote, "Into your hands I commend my spirit," end quote, Luke 23:46. These touches are more probably explained as Luke's additions to Mark than they are as Mark's omissions from Luke. For Mark has no reason to downplay Jesus' piety or prayerfulness. Luke clarifies details in Mark, for example, taking over the Mark and Jesus' declaration, quote, "I have not come to call the righteous but sinners," end quote. Mark 2:17, but adding, quote, to repentance, end quote. Luke 5:32, thus obviating the objection that Jesus simply liked to associate with evil persons. Features of this sort are better treated as Luke's additions to Mark than as Mark's omissions. Observations of this kind could be multiplied considerably. The point is that in comparing Matthew with Mark and Luke with Mark, it is almost always simpler to see Matthew and Luke as transforming Mark than vice versa. This leads us to conclude that of the four scenarios pictured in Figure 1, the most likely one is the simple branch, C, with Mark serving as the source for Matthew and Luke, who edited Mark and did so in different ways. The other synoptic source, 17, that's in reference to the 17th letter of the alphabet. So whenever that letter comes up, I will say 17 um, uh, in place of it. So you guys will know. Okay, if Matthew and Luke used Mark independently, we are still left to explain other material common to Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke share about 4,500 words that they did not get from Mark. This includes much of the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, the woes against the Pharisees, parables such as the yeast, the faithful and unfaithful servant, the great supper, the entrusted money, and sayings such as the Lord's Prayer and the warning about serving God or mammon. Let us call this material the quote double tradition. Just as I have argued with respect to the sayings and stories that Matthew and Luke share with Mark, with the double tradition too, we must assume some kind of literary relationship. Comparison of Matthew and Luke shows that the verbatim agreement in the double tradition ranges from 96% to less than 10%. In a significant number of pericope, the agreement is so high that it is impossible to suppose that Matthew and Luke have coincidentally taken over bits of oral tradition. Oh, sorry about that. Have taken over bits of oral tradition, adding these to Mark. They must have used a common document. Take, for instance, the woes against the Galilean cities, Matthew 11:20 to 24, and Luke 10:13 to 15. Although Matthew has an introduction unparalleled in Luke, the words of the oracle itself correspond closely. Jesus' speech comprises 78 words in Matthew and 46 in Luke, 45 of them identical with Matthew. So just curiosity, so these 78 words in Matthew and 46 in Luke and 45 in Matthew, are they Greek words or English words, I wonder? He didn't really say here. Anyways, sorry about that. I just got a little sidetracked, little squirrel there. Okay, as I remarked earlier, a propos of Matthew 3:7 to 10, Luke 3:7 to 9, agreements are not only vocabularic, but in the sequence of words. Both Matthew and Luke have the sequence, quote, but for Tyre and Sidon, more tolerable it shall be than for you, end quote. Had Matthew and Luke known this saying only via oral performances, we would expect not only greater differences in vocabulary, but also variation in word order. For example, quote, but it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you, end quote. Or, quote, but more tolerable it shall be for Tyre and Sidon than for you, end quote. Since Greek, unlike English, allows for sentence parts to come in many different sequences without a loss of meaning, Matthew and Luke's agreement is highly significant. The two agree on vocabulary and on verbal sequences. This kind of agreement is only intelligible if there is a direct or indirect literary relationship between the two. Even where Matthew does not have as high a level of agreement with Luke, it is still clear that a common source is being used. For example, both Matthew and Luke have Jesus warn of coming divisions. Okay, verse 34. Do not suppose that I have come to cast peace upon earth. I have not come to cast peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Matthew 10:34 to 36. And then here's one from Luke. Do you think that I am here to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For henceforth in one house there will be five divided, three against two, and two against three. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Luke 12:51 to 53. The degree of verbatim agreement is very much lower than in Matthew 11:20 to 24, Luke 10:13 to 15 cited above. It is nonetheless likely that Matthew and Luke are citing the same, saying that, it is nonetheless likely that Matthew and Luke are citing the same saying and that one or both have adjusted its wording. They agree on the basic structure of this saying, quote, do not suppose that, but, end quote. Then a rationale introduced by for, and finally an illusion of divisions by reference to a household. Matthew's version uses more visual language. He speaks of casting or throwing, balin, peace, as if peace were a substance that can be thrown like seeds. Luke, by contrast, uses the more abstract term division. Nonetheless, Matthew and Luke, and hence their source, agree in treating division as epitomized in household division. This is a significant agreement, since divisions might just as easily have been illustrated by feuds between neighbors or among clans or between villages or battles between kingdoms. Further, both imagine a patrilocal Palestinian marriage where the wife comes to live with her husband's kin so that mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law are in the same house. Thus, even when verbal agreement is quite low, and this periscope has the third lowest verbal agreement of any in the double tradition, and there's an endnote here, you guys can check that out, there are still strong grounds for concluding that Matthew and Luke had a common source and modified it to fit their literary tastes. If the materials which Matthew and Luke have in common and which are not present in Mark are related literarily, how should we imagine that relationship? We have already excluded any arrangement of the three Gospels that puts Matthew in direct contact with Luke, since in that case one would expect to find instances where Matthew agrees with Luke's sequence against Mark, and we do not find any such agreements. And we would expect, for example, Luke to have some of the same additions to Mark that Matthew made, or for Matthew to have adopted some of Luke's additions to Mark. The fact that Matthew and Luke lack each other's major modifications to Mark suggests that they have not seen each other's work. This leaves as a simple solution to this leaves as the simplest solution a second simple branch solution, like Mark's relationship to Matthew and Luke, but applying this model to the double tradition. And there's an endnote about that. You guys can check that out. Since we do not know what this document was called, scholars have adopted this siglum 17 from the German word Quell or source. See figure 2. If we then combine the Markan simple branch with the 17th simple branch, we arrive at what scholars call the two-document 2DH or two-source hypothesis. The two documents being Mark and 17. See Figure 3. This arrangement makes sense of three key data sets. Number one, the two-document hypothesis makes sense of the fact that Matthew and Luke tend not to agree with each other against Mark in the wording of stories that Mark has. This is because each edits Mark independently and hence usually edits Mark in different ways. And there's an endnote about that. And so before we go on, so there's a little simple graph here. It's called simple branch, figure 2. And you got 17 on the top with Matthew and Luke branching out on the bottom. All right. And although both Matthew and Luke sometimes relocate, Markan stories or sayings to new locations, they never move the same story to the same non-Markan location. So here's another graph of figure 3. Let me move the camera out a little bit so you guys can see the whole thing. I'm not going to attempt to describe this because I have no idea how to describe it. So this figure 3 is the two document hypothesis. So you got arrows representing oral transmission and arrows representing literary influence. And you kind of got them going back and forth between 17, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that's all I'm going to say about that. If you have a book, you guys can check it out in your book, or you guys can, if you have if you're watching this on YouTube, you can look at it here. And for those who are listening, mm, uh, you know, whatever works for you. So here's the chart. Just gonna leave it there for a couple seconds. You guys can pause if you want to look at it. All right, continue. Okay. Number 2, the second set of data concerns the 17 material. Where there is often a high degree of verbal agreement between Matthew and Luke within these sections, there is practically no agreement in the placement of these sayings relative to Mark. Matthew places his Beatitudes after the Markan story of the four fishermen, Matthew 4:18 to 22, Mark 1:16 to 20 and 21, or Mark's description of Jesus' preaching tour through the Galilee, Matthew 4:23 and Mark 1:39, depending upon how synoptic tables are aligned. Luke, however, inserted the Beatitudes following the Markan story of the healing of the man with a withered hand. Luke 6:6 to 11, Mark 3:1 to 6, and the naming of the 12. Luke 6:12 to 16, Mark 3:13 to 19. Matthew used the woes against the Galilean towns as part of Jesus' attack on this generation's rejection of John the Baptist and Jesus. Matthew 11:2 to 30. In Luke, they form part of the commissioning speech directed at the 72 disciples. Luke 10:1 to 16. Similarly, Matthew used the saying on serving two masters in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:24, while in Luke it appears two-thirds of the way through this gospel after the parable of the unjust steward and various sayings concerning money and greed, Luke 16:1 to 13. There is, in other words, nothing to suggest that Matthew was influenced by Luke's placement of the 17 material or vice versa. Had there been direct relationship between Matthew and Luke, Luke using Matthew or Matthew using Luke, one would expect Matthew's placement of the 17 material relative to Mark to have influenced Luke's editorial choices or vice versa. There are only 3 pericope, all related, where Matthew and Luke agree on placing the 17 material in the same relative position. in the opening section of Matthew and Luke dealing with John the Baptist and Jesus' temptation. See figure 4. In all three cases, 17, chapter 3, verse 3, 7b to 9, 3, 16 to 17, and 4, 1 to 13, the 17 material overlapped Mark in content. John's preaching of repentance in 17, 3, 7b to 9 contain an introduction to John's oracle, 17, 3, 3, 7a, which overlapped Mark 1, 2 to 6. Both Mark and 17 contained a version of the prediction of the coming stronger one, although 17's version, 17, 3, 16 to 17, was longer than Mark's, Mark 1, 7 to 8. And both 17 and Mark had a testing story. Mark's being only 2 verses long, 1, 12, and 13, while 17 had an elaborate 3-part test, 17, 4, 1 to 13. Naturally, Matthew and Luke attached the 17 saying regarding John's preaching to the same Markan pericope. Mark 1, 2 to 6, because there Mark is also describing John's preaching. Similarly, Mark's version of John's prediction of the stronger one, Mark 1, 7 to 8, was the obvious point at which to use 17's longer prediction of the coming one and his eschatological activities, 17, 3, 16 to 17. Finally, Mark's short account of Jesus' temptation, Mark 1, 12 to 13, is virtually the only place at which Matthew and Luke could have used 17's longer and more elaborate temptation account, 17, 4, 1 to 13. But after this point in Mark, Matthew and Luke are consistent in not placing 17 material in the same place relative to Mark. This is explicable if Matthew and Luke are not in direct contact. Neither had seen how the other had connected Mark and 17. Consider the imaginary scenario of having 2 documents, one a narrative about a hero, and the other a collection of the hero's sayings and speeches. If you were to give these 2 documents to 5 students, asking them to produce a single narrative document that combined the 2 sources, stipulating that they could not work together, they would likely produce 5 different combinations of the 2 documents. This is what happened with Matthew and Luke. Okay, so before we go on, this is figure 4, and I'm not going to describe it or go over it because it looks kind of complicated, but I will, let's see if I can fit the whole thing in the camera here. Okay, so this is figure 4. I'll just leave it there for a few seconds if you guys want to look at it. And I'm not sure if you guys can blow it up if you want to look at, or zoom in if you want to look at it closer. But this is figure 4, Matthew-Luke agreements in placing the double tradition. So we've got the 17 gospel on one column, and then Matthew 1 column, Mark 1 column, Luke 1 column, and then 17 again at the end of the column. And then a comparison of their different stories and verses and chapters and stuff like that. So I won't go over it, but you guys can look at it. If you have a book, you guys can study it if you want. Okay. All right, I'm going to move the camera in again. Okay. Number 3. Third, if one does not measure sequential agreement of the 17 materials in Matthew and Luke relative to Mark, but relative to each other, approximately 1/3 of the pericope, accounting for almost 1/2 of the word count, are in the same relative order. That is, in spite of the fact that Matthew and Luke place the 17 material differently relative to Mark, they nonetheless agree in using many of the sayings and stories in the same order relative to each other. Imagine aligning Matthew and Luke in parallel columns and then removing all of the sayings and stories that they took over from Mark, and hence all of the points at which 17 material was attached to the Markan outline. What would result is a set of 17 sayings that appear in the same relative order. Okay, before we go on, there is another table here, sequential agreements of Matthew and Luke in reproducing the 17 material. So you got a column for Matthew, column from Luke, and another column for Matthew and another column for Luke. And these are just comparisons of the chapters and verses that are in these respective books. So I won't read that. I won't go over that, but I will, oops, sorry about that. I will move the camera out and pause it so you guys can look at it. If you guys want to do a deeper comparison, a deeper dive, you guys are welcome to do that. So I'll just pause it here for a couple seconds. You guys can pause it there as well. Okay. I'm just moving the camera in a little bit here. All right, continuing. The sequential agreement that exists between Matthew and Luke's double tradition, 35 of the 92 pericope of the double tradition, or about 40%, suggests strongly that even if Matthew and Luke were not in direct contact with each other, something influenced their arrangement of the material included in the double tradition. Of course, both Matthew and Luke apparently felt free to relocate 17 sayings to other locations, just as they did with Mark's stories, but the extent of their agreement suggests that 17 is not just a set of oral traditions, which do not have any intrinsic order, but a written document whose sequence strongly influenced Matthew and Luke's reproduction of it. It must be reiterated at this point that scholars have not invented 17 out of an interest in multiplying sources or because they are fascinated with mysterious and lost documents. On the contrary, the positing of 17 is purely a function of conclusions about the relationship of Matthew and Luke to Mark. Observations of the patterns of agreements and disagreements in wording and in sequence among the Gospels indicates that Mark occupies a medial position between Matthew and Luke. Careful comparison of Mark to Matthew and Mark to Luke suggests that Mark is not only medial, but prior to Matthew and Luke, and served as one of their sources. And if this is the case, then it is necessary to account for the double tradition, or 17 material, that Matthew and Luke share, which they did not take from Mark. If Matthew and Mark were not in direct contact with each other for the Markian material, they cannot very well have been in direct contract with the 17 material. I think that's a typo, because here it says if Matthew and Luke were not in direct contact, then they could not have been in direct contact. That's a typo there. Yeah, I kind of. Okay, sorry about that. A little squirrel. I do that once in a while. Okay, continue. This leaves only one viable possibility, that the double tradition material comes from another source, parallel to Mark, insofar as it was also a source for Matthew and Luke, used independently by each. Okay, we'll stop here for now. It's interesting. This is a very left brain book, if you know what I mean. A lot of dissecting, a lot of detail. Not quite my cup of tea, but I think for me, it's more important to learn and understand the essence of of the teachings rather than, all the charts and graphs and things like that. But, to each his own. Some people learn better left brain. Uh, but we really should be in the right brain because that's where God is. So, anyways, let me know what you think. What do you think of this section? Are you getting some learning something from it? What is your experience from reading it? I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, so I hope you guys all have a great day, great afternoon, great evening, wherever you guys are. And we will see you next time in our next book club. Okay, bye now.